our unemployment rate is not an accident, it's by design. So there's no intergenerational value.
When you say design, was it intentional design or accidental design?
Well, when it is sustained, then it's not accident.
I have the great pleasure of sitting with Dr. Pali Lehohla, an esteemed colleague and a powerful leader in the struggle in South Africa, who's made a distinct contribution over decades in South Africa. Thank you for joining me.
No, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. You've mentioned to me that you want to talk around the topic of education and its broader impact in society. Take me through a quick intro to what you think is the issue.
Well, I'm a product of two teachers. My mother and my father were teachers, so I think education becomes a natural prospect and a natural reaction to how I see challenges. I look at those through the lens of education. And it's something that is pricking my mind, and it has stayed that way in the case of South Africa, both because of historical reasons and the evolution of that, and which becomes the major challenge today as we think about fourth industrial or fifth industrial revolution, or even the previous industrial revolutions. But what also is very interesting in South Africa is, you need to dig your bucket where you are in terms of diagnosing the problem, because the instruments and everything is there.
Yes.
I've been trained as a statistician. I studied in Lesotho at the University of Lesotho, and then at the University of Ghana as a demographer. And then, of course, I had a few management or leadership at Harvard when I started work. The country used to send us to Harvard to go and understand leadership.
Yes. Was it at the Kennedy School?
At the Kennedy School of Government, yes, which was quite enlightening. And I must say, at the time I went there, I was struggling with the census of 2001.
Oh, wow.
And the immediate thing that came to mind was when we actually looked at information technology and the common failures that underlie it, which is memory was the biggest thing at the time.
Yes.
Which is not a problem now, but memory was the biggest thing. And when you go up to scale, when things actually fail, I think it was Panam that failed because it had introduced online booking.
Yes.
And on the day of the launch, the thing crashed. We had the same problem as we were processing the census. So that was the immediate applicable solution to my problem. Because memory was a big problem, because not only were we processing data through scanning, but we were bringing, images, terabytes and terabytes of data into the system because of imaging.
Yes. Out
of which, the data was just 6 gigabytes. The useful data that you needed was 6 gigabytes. So moving from that to a 6 gigabyte CD data was the biggest challenge.
There was no object character recognition.
You had to scan the images.
Yes.
And then, of course, there was the object character recognition, extracting that thing. Yes. And then, of course, the intelligent mark reader, which had to string that. It wasn't just picking what the fields are, but it had to interpret that and string. So that entire process was memory consuming, and we didn't have enough memory because the last time we ran the census was just key entry, which takes very little. But now we have introduced this imaging that so transforming from those terabytes to a small gigabyte so it was quite interesting.
You mentioned Harvard, and I just want to touch on that before we go deeper into our discussion. Something in my experience, having been at Harvard a couple of times for different things, is the opportunity it creates for a large worldview, where you're not in a microcosm anymore. And I'll give you an example. When we were doing a healthcare program with the ASOF program in South Africa, when we were talking NHI 12, 15 years ago, and the minister said, well, we're working on this and we're piloting that, and you had somebody like Tom Bossett, Mark Roberts, who were in healthcare for 40 years. they'll tell you, you know, in 1992 when we did Chile, in 1987 when we did this, and you're like, how many have you done? It's like, well, the developing world about 60, 80. And I'm like, so where do you share this information? Oh, we run the World Bank program for healthcare leaders in the world. I'm like, wow. And it gives you that broader outlook. I mean, how was your experience with especially Harvard?
Well, it was very interesting, actually. The program was very good, I would say, because it brought both government, private sector, and civil society together. Yes. And the way they would be, the professors would be very provocative. It was a melting pot. Unfortunately, I think we started receding from that when actually it was a microcosm in terms of getting people together, but it was a macrocosm in terms of the ideas that we had to share amongst ourselves as South Africans, private sector, public sector. And the debates could be acrimonious between the private and the public sector people, and then, of course, the NGO society. It should have been augmented because it would create the kind of lens that we require to look at societal problems in South Africa. Yeah. But it was not continued. I do not know, maybe because it's fairly expensive. I mean, you have to put almost R1 million per person on that kind of program. So it for a year, it was quite pricey. But I think it was not a price so high not to proceed with it, given the kind of challenges that we have.
And, you know, I know we want to get to education. We look at a country where at the moment, 90%, or no, I wouldn't say 90%, a large proportion of professional skill that we need is provided by consultants, which runs into billions. But if you took the current leadership in particular roles, administrative decision makers, people like yourself in your former role and others, and you send them to Harvard, even a Harvard MBA, or you send them for an executive program, something like GMP, which is only 8 weeks, or the 8 weeks or 12 weeks, and then you've got the GMP, which is 7 to 12 weeks full-time, but you're amongst the best in the world, and you've got the melting pot of ideas and the faculty to drive that learning. It's actually a fraction of what you actually outsource and don't own the capacity to do internally in government. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, yes, I mean, one of the things that we had, working with a person like Trevor Manuel, a very interesting person. Consultants you need, but you don't need them forever. Yes, and I think how you bring them on board is an important matter. I mean, and who you bring on board. For instance, when we are transforming Stats SA, for example, this was side by side with this Harvard program, not instigated by Harvard program, but insights brought from the Harvard program. I had an elderly retiree from Statistics Canada, a number 2 there. And we had to sit down and say, how are we going to transform this organization? Because I had a crisis of consumer price index.
Yes.
That had just, cost the country 50 billion. Of course, there were people who gained from that miscalculation of the consumer price index. There are those who lost. Government was one of those who lost money because of that miscalculation. In part because the Treasury didn't provide the right money. But back to how Trevor used to work with us. He never wanted a consultant to me or to anyone present to him. He wanted you to present. And that put pressure for you to understand and manage the consultant.
Yes. Even though you needed the skill to help you get the package of information or the position, you must own that outcome.
You must own that outcome. And he said, I'm not running consultants, otherwise I would have appointed them.
Yes.
I don't even have them in my organization, of course. So, and that's what he actually inculcated in the ministries that he was running. Or departments that we was running. And we adopted that very well by actually saying, now you, Mr. Consultant, you will work with the people who produce the labor numbers, and those guys will come and report to me. And you will come on your own to come and report to me as to how we should actually run this whole thing. But training was at the core. So we built that capacity. So now when you look at Stats, they say it has a very deep capacity. That will last for long. Yes. So that's very important.
But now we look at the world's best training, the Ivy Leagues as they call it, the Harvard of the world, at that level of teaching, training, and consulting. And you and I spoke offline earlier, but where does that leave our children and our grandchildren and the children of other people today? The child that lives across the race line, anybody that's now impoverished and reliant on an education system, to think of a future like I did and you did many moons ago, where Harvard was an impossibility. What do we do for the kids at that point to change their future for a better future, not just to attend a Harvard, but to lead mega organizations like yourself and many others did?
Well, I mean, thinking of Harvard, that's not affordable. I mean, it's a system that, if one were to look at it carefully, it's not a system for everybody. It's a system designed for a few. Yet, information technology now can actually expose everyone to what Harvard provides. So there is a possibility for everyone to achieve and acquire the kinds of knowledge that are there at the Ivy Leagues. But of course, people still control. They want to milk the cow until it bleeds. But let's shift from there and say, well, what do you do and what is the reading of the numbers in South Africa, which I've been reading for a very long period of time, and they leave me sleepless if I have to use that lens looking into the future, because absolutely, if I think about Morena Mohlomi is a Mosotho man, I come from Lesotho, by the way, who lived in the 18th century. He ran an academy in Ngodile, which is in which was Lesotho, but now it's a present-day Free State in South Africa. He ran an academy in Ngodile, and his academy focused on intergenerational value. And when you look at that academy, he actually emphasized 2 or 3 things.
Okay.
The first was you must pursue peace. You must mobilize stakeholders towards that peace building.
Yes.
You must create intergenerational value. But above all, he understood technology. He said integrated reporting.
Back then.
And you cannot have integrated reporting if you don't have technology and data. And that, for me, has shifted my lens to how does this integrated reporting, because now you can see a person who has systems thinking and systems design driven. Yes. Now, coming to the situation in South Africa. A census, and I've run the first 3, 1996, 2001, and 2011.
Yes.
And then, of course, everything in between. And then, of course, the current statistician general ran the 2022. So looking at all this data, including the 2022 results,
yes,
a census is a time machine. And from that time machine, you can see progress or lack thereof. And that progress you can look at through the lens of progression ratios.
Yes.
There is no chance in hell that South Africa will get out of this trouble. Using those progression ratios, including the 2022 census.
For those of us who don't understand what these progression ratios mean, for a layperson, what does that mean, particularly in my understanding, a snapshot in a moment in time, and then the trend analysis over time? What does that mean? Well,
the benefit of a census is this time machine. So we can actually look at the living now and say, if we are living with a life expectancy of 75 years, you can project backwards from for those who are 75 years now, yes, look at them when they were 20 years or 10 years and so on,
okay,
and compare them with those who are 10 years, 15 years today, and look at how the trend of experience has been. And education is an important one because it occurs, or at least it's experienced,
yes,
by the largest majority, or when they are excluded, it also shows you the largest majority are excluded. So when you look at age analysis through this commonly available commodity called education, you can see the differentials. And South Africa, because of its history of race, we have whites, colored, Indian, and black, you see these trends, and you see how these trends differ. And it is in that difference that the distinction becomes very clear. And that's why I'm saying not in 100 years, not in 1,000 years, given the trends that are happening in all the censuses that I've been responsible for, including the one that the Statistician General has done, that with the outcomes and the outputs of education, there is no chance for South Africa to succeed. So when you take the aggregate, you find that the trend in that progression is downwards. When you separate that by race, well, because 90% of the population is downwards, when you look at the aggregate, it will pull that average. Now you separate it by white, Indian, colored, and black. The colors group together, and they account for 90% of the population. So it's downwards. Now, the sad part, and this is post-school education. The sad part is that the trough from which all this source of information or the children that are there, they've reached the maximum value. It's not changing for the last so many years.
Wow.
The level of matric pass has flattened. So out of 1.2 million children that are born, who should in another 12 years after their birth, or whatever, not 12 years, 17 years of their birth, they should reach matric.
Yes.
That has leveled. And 500,000 are lost to the system.
That's even with the advent of technology solutions.
So it's with all that. And now 250,000 of those will succeed to complete matric with a decent pass. So, and that has flattened. Now, the receiving end in the form of a university can only take 160,000 and the rest go to technicons and the like.
Yes.
But that has flattened at a very low rate. So if you take 1.2 million and 250,000 succeeding, it means that minus those who die, it means that about 900,000, 800,000 are lost every year. So this is the tragedy.
Year.
This is the tragedy, yes, because 1.2 million are born, so that 1.2 million is carried through as a cohorts minus those who die. So our unemployment rate is not an accident, it's by design. So there is no intergenerational value that Mohlomi talks about in the 1800th century.
When you say design, was it intentional design or accidental design?
Well, when it is sustained, then it's not accident. It's intentional. It may well be that it was not intended, but it's intentional. And this unintended, intentional, is because of the ignorance, the gap of ignorance.
Yes.
So I didn't intend it. I didn't know it will become that way, where you actually should have known. And that's the ignorance gap. And that ignorance gap is in the leadership. So that's the problem. And that's where the
solution is, I mean, today, some of these solutions, amongst many other positive solutions, is you throw 250 Rand or 350 Rand a month and say, well, sit at home anyway.
Yeah.
And when I look at it from the outside, I'm saying, I'm not opposed to a universal basic income. But then you perpetuate the system.
Well, when you don't come with a solution-driven kind of thing, you just let the wound to fester. That's what is happening. I mean, you have to stop the bleeding. That must be the intention. And if you don't show that you want to stop the bleeding and also ensure that the patient survives, which is the 350, that's survival, but you have to show a very clear strategy to stopping the bleeding. That intervention of stopping the bleeding doesn't exist in our edifice. Yeah. That is why this trend for blacks and colors continues. Now, look at 1953. And this is the beauty of where South Africa's unfortunate race-based development provides some insights. If you look at whites, they've always been on an upward trend. And this is where the progression ratios are helpful. because they show that there's generational value, adding value all the time. The Indians in 1953, I mean, the Indians were indentured labor in South Africa, just bundled with blacks, they were the same.
Yes.
Before 1953, this was the same when you look at educational performance. Then Verwoerd in 1953, September 23rd, he says, what's the use of teaching Bantu children mathematics when they can't use it in practice? Wow. You see the trend of the Indians increasing at primary and almost, monotonically rising to catch with the whites. So this has been the case. And at university, you see that generational value amongst Indians. For blacks, that rise was minimal. As you go to matric, it drops relative to the other population groups. At university, in fact, you see declines.
Yes.
So there's no generational value. So in the absence of generational value for the 90% of the majority population, there's no generational value for the country. Therefore, we are destined to sink.
Obviously, I'm Indian descent. So obviously, there may be an unconscious bias in my questions. But there's also a perception, which has now perpetuated in various communities of, well, Indians have. Almost putting the Indian community, if one were to draw racial lines, as privileged as the historical whites in South Africa. But having lived it, we came from indenture.
That's why...
Come through. And I'm not saying all Indians, because I can tell you now, even in my family, there's a few exceptions of us who've broken getting past the bread line. And there are many who aren't across that line, even today. And I'm talking about my immediate extended family. I can give you a list of 100 people top of my mind, of my immediate first-degree relatives. And we all, assist each other as a broader societal support and a family support. But what is that distinction factor that has nothing to do with race that helps the success? And I don't want to focus on Indians. I want to say, what worked then? Can we apply that now across the system? Well,
this is where the racial analysis becomes very important, because it's taking the lessons that created that condition for generational value and say, how are they transferable here? Because we can see the result. For whites, it was apartheid. Clear. I mean, you don't want a reverse apartheid. You don't want to apply that. For Indians, they were indentured labor. At this moment, when the policy was explicit about was the use of teaching Bantu child mathematics, you can see an immediate reaction from the Indians in terms of the performance. Now we've got to go there and say, what are the elements that were embedded in this reaction? The effect of the reaction is very clear. It was a reaction to a political announcement. And there are elements there. Probably the Indians started building their own schools. Blacks tried, but it didn't work. And so it is that which, and then you said there are poor amongst Indians, certainly, but there's a social system amongst them that provides help one to the other. And they also, like blacks, have families, extended family.
Yes.
Amongst blacks, the extended family doesn't bring that generational value because it doesn't have the undergirding education system that actually takes them out of poverty. It's a social system largely driven by the Ubuntu concept that underlies the black community. But when it doesn't have economic levers, it cannot generate generational value. And that's what you see when you look at employment. If you look at the employment of the Indians, particularly and whites, at the level of that correlates with, or rather that demands skill, the growth of the skilled by age group is distinctly generational value creating amongst the Indians and whites. You take 1994, particularly amongst Indians, who were probably at about 25%, 30%, they've grown by 20 to 30 percentage points to 50% in each of the age groups.
From an economic
Yes, from a skilled point.
Okay.
For each age group, it will be 15 to 24, 25 to 34, and 40 and 50 to 64. The growth between 94 to now has been significant, almost doubled, or in fact grown 3 times, threefold. For whites, it's almost doubled, particularly, and the younger generation. For blacks, for those who are 15, 20 to 30, 25 to 34, this thing was about 17% in 1994. It's reduced to 14%. Reduced. And across all ages, it's only 20%. Whereas amongst Indians and whites, it's almost 50%.
What would be the drivers behind that? Because obviously the circumstances, yes, there may be, let's say, 40 years of an apartheid system. Post-94, we're 30 years down the line. What's maintaining that sustained growth in particular groupings, and how can we draw inferences to help the rest of our community?
It is this post-school performance which shows a decline perpetually. And that's where generational value is lost, because it's in creating education that will create generational. Amongst Indians, the graph is upward trending. Amongst whites, the graph is upward trending. Amongst blacks, it's downward trending. So we cannot win that battle, and you'll see it in employment. So this is...
There is something that we see, and please shoot me down, and I'm going to talk in broad strokes. I'll get criticized for this. And I can speak in my example, is when my father, and like the Bantu education system that existed, he worked for Professor Fatima Mir in the 80s, teaching Afrikaans and other Afrikaans and English to the Bantu schools as it was. And there was a focus of communities, we're talking in the 80s and 90s, to growth and development across the racial lines. Let's call it all blacks, the same signatories to that freedom charter.
Yes.
All of them wanted to make progress consistently. And I wouldn't say post-94, but probably I became more aware of it in the mid to late 2000s and probably the last 20 years, is when somebody graduates, and I can speak from an example of medical school or in business world, and I'm talking of the traditional families. In my family, if we made 100 Rand extra, the logic was you save half and a percentage you invest into education and growth. And in some communities, and I'm not going to mention the particular grouping, that 100 Rand buys a bottle of Hennessy and you drink it today. Now, there's something missing in the perception of why would some groups say save for tomorrow and save for education? And the other groups are like, well, I'll spend it on my car or I'll drink this weekend. And it's not even entire weekend, it's finished on Friday. By Saturday, you're back to where you were before you had that 100 Rand. So what do you think stimulates these social dynamics? Yes, I'm well aware, whether from a medical perspective or otherwise, that a lot of these social tools like alcohol and TV and others are meant, and I mean, I'm ex-military, I came from that world. Alcohol was subsidized because your life was so miserable, they said if they kept you drunk, you wouldn't notice.
Absolutely,
And that's the social engineering around the status brands of alcohol and beers and others. But underlying that, what happened to a common purpose of those who were behind the Freedom Charter? To the distinction between the communities now, like you drawing the analogy of, well, one part of that, the signatories of the Freedom Charter have continued growing.
Yes.
And the others have stagnated. What's led to that?
In fact, not stagnated, but regressed. Because if you look at people who had completed matric successfully pre-1994, they went on to complete their degrees in record time, regardless of race.
Yes.
You could see that generational value, although there were fewer amongst blacks, but you could see that increase positively. This time around, there are more, but when you have a vessel that is leaking, you are not making progress. So you may have a bigger base of people that complete degrees, but if they are not progressing and they are generationally regressing, and when you have a generationally regressing society, you cannot expect a different future or a better future. It will be different in terms of it will take you to. So coming to your question, most of the Indian families became business people, but they didn't see their children in that corner cafe. Or they saw them as a doctor, as an accountant, as a lawyer.
Yes.
So they saw education in real terms as a stepping stone to something different.
Yes.
And I think it was that ingrained value that created acceleration in generational value.
I see.
That is at the core of this. So if we were to think about small businesses as an engine of growth, we must be able to tie it to how it becomes a vehicle for investing in multiplicity of education disciplines that create value.
Yes. I can identify what you're talking to because, obviously my grandmother's now late, but my grandfather was crippled when my grandmother was 21, 5 children to take care of. And she didn't sit back and say, well, what can I do about it? She, I understand, is she worked as a domestic in various houses. She ran a hawking business. She eventually created what was a primitive version of a laundromat, which was a fire and half a drum with boiling water. She did whatever she needed to do to survive back then. But it was an uncle of hers who told her, but you need to buy land. And he helped her buy it, and they were buying half cent a month. I don't know what she was saving. But she had this phrase, and we joke about it now, God bless her, is she said, Terrence, must buy cash, don't buy credit. Well, they couldn't get credit. No credit, right? But it was impossible. But she said, you buy what you want and you build cash. And her focus was to build that family up. And through that process, some of my cousins have made phenomenal progress. We've moved through that. My father came from very similar circumstances. But the focus was always education. That's how I landed in Pretoria, because I needed education, but we didn't have the funds. So I got a scholarship, and 25 years later, I'm still here. But it's also the mentality has changed. Because I know you're talking about broad strokes of Indians and KZN, but it's not all. Because what frustrates me about the communities, like you speak of the rest of our black communities, is in KZN, is there's this mentality of negativity. A guy has a job or an opportunity to learn, and he only does it within fixed hours, 8 to 5. And I have cousins who've told me, but Terrence, how do you live the lifestyle you do? Like, because when you switch your TV on Friday to watch every game and every replay of Man United or Liverpool across a weekend to a Sunday, and I had that a Monday, I had a cousin live with me. Like, why do you work so hard? I said, because that's why I make twice what you do. Because I do the time. And eventually one day I asked him, I said, so how much time do you spend watching Premier League? He said, actually, I don't know. I said, go work it out. The time watching football was 35 hours a week, which is almost an entire working week. And he says, but I love it. And I said, I'd love to work that extra hours on the weekend, which I do anyway, so I can go watch the game live and not on TV. So there is also, as much as the statistics may say there is a broad growth of the Indian community, I think it's, again, pockets of the community. Because the bulk of them, like the rest of, if I say all black people, there's that instant gratification mentality. And they often, when you meet family and cousins and people and guys, like, but Terrence, how do you get this experience? Well, to get 5 years experience is an easy way. Do the time.
put in the time.
Put in the time.
You ask the question, why does this go to vodka or all that and the subsidy? Obviously, it was a very deliberate strategy of apartheid.
Oh, absolutely.
That the students in 1976, when they rose, they actually said, let's target these beer halls because this is what is crippling us.
Yes.
But that strategy didn't sustain politically to create a movement that says, let's weed ourselves, let's wean ourselves of bad habits.
Yes.
And of course, because it was not weaned, we didn't wean it from ourselves. When freedom came, the victory of freedom is what bottle, how many years of this bottle, what watch, what sneakers you put on. And when we saw the campaign, people walking with their 2,000, 5,000 sneakers.
Or coming with a G-Wagon.
A G-Wagon coming through a filled street.
Yes.
That's the irony of the whole thing. And you still think you can win an election. Now, that's where the disjuncture and dysfunction is ingrained. A show of ill-gotten gains against a populace that is grindingly poor.
Absolutely.
And the service. So to still think that through that process you can win an election then begs the question, is there a grain of brain? It is that which we actually have to root out.
Yes. Many people have been saying it's impossible, as some call the coalition's doomsday, and it's impossible and it's endemic. And I hate the example that I'm about to make because it talks to your narrative at a bigger picture. But India is 1.4 billion people, the largest democracy in the world. It was completely corrupt for decades. Again, with a very similar history to South Africa because of international issues. It wasn't really apartheid, it was the British and a whole move of dynamics and then religious wars and other issues going on. And they said it was impossible to solve because some things just couldn't be done. Then comes Prime Minister Modi to power. And he didn't come out of the nowhere. He was there for the last 40 years, but had a plan. And if you look at the last 10 years where India was back then, when Prime Minister Vajpayee used to go to events and other prime ministers to go and they're on the sidelines, Modi's now in the center of a lot of attention and party to a lot of major decision makings. Because I wouldn't say he's got all of the corruption cleaned up, but he's put in systems so much so that he leads from the front, where one, he doesn't take a salary, he doesn't like those fancy perks. Obviously, the security issue is a security issue, but his focus is on how do we transform this country? How do we centralize the money? How do we keep it transparent and effective? How do we get infrastructure delivered? And if we're proud of our cow train, they build a cow train every month or two on an extension of a network. And in South Africa, we say, well, we must wait for zoning and approval to know where to put the line, and it's 10 years worth of planning. And India's strategy is simple. Even in a highly populated metropolitan city, they're like, so where are you going to put this new line? It's simple. We own the road. Put a bridge. Run it up above there. Right above the road. Everywhere across the country. And it works. Because if you can move people and move systems, then you got better opportunities. But at a macro level, the political will and the ability to reduce corruption is there. What do you think it's going to take for us? And I know that's a political discussion, but from an education lens, because I agree with you, is if I didn't have the political education, the exposure, the experiences and relationships I've built over the years, far less than yours, I wouldn't have a particular worldview. Whether biased or not, or conscious or not, is because it's because of exposure, connections, and networks. And that education is a large portion. But then we've also got to talk to the factor, like you spoke of, I wouldn't say mostly Indian communities, but a lot of the white communities, are network connections. Because the leader of what was the previous opposition has only a matric. And he got there anyway. So, it goes against the argument of education gets you where you need. How do we find a link or reflect on solutions between network connectivity, which also helps generate wealth, together with education at the same time?
Well, I think at the core of it is resources. Blacks have these things called stockpiles, which is basically savings, community savings.
Yes.
They aggregate it, but it doesn't generate value.
Yes.
So the network community is clearly there. And those instruments of networking are absolutely there. And they are the biggest consumers of consumer goods.
Yes.
Now, it is working those networks favorably towards themselves. And it will not happen for as long as the 350 visits their account, and no sooner it has gone back to Joburg to Checkers, ShopRite, and so on.
Yes.
And it doesn't circulate amongst the community.
Correct.
And that design, it's meant to be that design because it's extractive.
Yes.
Now, reversing that design such that it is not extractive, it can change the way the blacks function. It is that banning of all these shebeens and the places where people drank alcohol, which was a deliberate strategy by apartheid to say keep them busy, drunk at least over the weekend.
Yes.
Changing that as Soweto 1976 rose. It's what is needed, but it must be sustained, and it needs active citizenry, and it needs very, very, very focused attention, because the network as capital is there.
Yes.
It's available there. It just needs to be exploited. And it can be that the Stokvels take their money to Sanlam and not to themselves. And today, banking may be simple, and those Stokvels can actually own 90%, 80% of what South Africa has. It is that cord that has to be cut. And it shouldn't take long before it is cut.
Yes.
But the leaders or people that we have put in leadership positions are a conduit of this perpetual exploitation.
Yes.
Of people that otherwise could be liberated.
Absolutely.
And that, I think, is the problem.
Dr. Pali, let's look at this from a different perspective for a moment. And you mentioned we need resources and access. I'll give you a very microscopic example. I've got staff that work at my different businesses, and they work at, some of them live in our different properties. And I've told them several times, to save you the cost of travel, I will give you either heavily subsidized, if not free accommodation for
at on site,
to live within a kilometer of where you need to. Some of them actually live in my properties. I will give you access to all of the resources you need, because there's this large conversation of saying, well, if we had access to digital technology and internet and all of that. I have every single one across my staff in the different businesses, including my domestic staff, have uninhibited access to the fiber at my house. I've given them laptops. Even my domestic staff, I said, here's laptops. You can watch Netflix, you can watch YouTube, you can watch what you want. But what I'd like you to do is I've identified these 4 or 5 broad structures of how does business work? How does economy work? How does money work? How do you become an entrepreneur? Basic tools for you to understand the mechanics of this economic system. I'd like you to do it, and then we can have this conversation.
Yes,
so at least I can share my experience or other people's experience, but I need you to get the tools yourself. Because now I've removed the barrier of cost, I've removed the barrier of access, I've removed the barrier of travel. It's now in your hands. Do you know how many have taken it up? None. Now, where does the problem lie? Because I've sat, because this is the fundamental challenge, is that in one breath we say we need the resources. Then we give the resources. And then nothing happens.
Well, I think, it's probably have to go back to Mohlomi over the 4 things that he says should happen. And, he talks about a responsible leader. When he says a responsible leader does these 4 things. He doesn't just say a leader. He says a responsible leader, which is pursuing peace, which is basically what we are pursuing, a peace, that there has to be peace. Mobilizing stakeholders, which is what we are doing. These are stakeholders that we are saying, hey, get these things because they'll help you, and we can have a conversation.
Yes.
Looking at integrated reporting. Probably it is at that level of integrated reporting across the stakeholders themselves who have to be organized together to share ideas and say, what does this all mean to us? Rather than, I don't know how you organize that, but talking to each one individually helps. But when they aggregate that process together, it may actually generate the necessary conversation amongst themselves.
Yes.
You as the catalyst saying, these are the tools that are available. How do you negotiate yourselves around these tools? It might well be that is what is necessary. I do not know.
Absolutely.
So it is exploring all those almost simultaneously. Then perhaps the results will emerge. It takes time. It may take their children to recognize that and to do what you are thinking. It may be too early to expect that they'll bite this too quickly.
Yes.
Because they have to digest what this means in their own kinds of circumstances.
Correct.
Yes, yeah.
Then if we look at the broad entertainment and content, and we'll talk just South Africa and African perspective, it's either very strongly music-related entertainment, without mentioning names. The other extreme that I've seen a trend of recently, and there's very few who don't meet that broad stroke picture that I have in my mind, is in criticizing people and their success. And it's almost very sort of newspaper kind of bullish approach of let's dig into this one's background and dig into that. And everybody has a history, but let's celebrate their successes. But there's too few conversations that meaningfully say, let's look at Dr. Pali Lehohla's journey. And it may have not been perfect, and we don't want to know all of it. But what were the steps you took, and what were the steps that your parents took? And let's celebrate that journey. Because I've taken time, and a lot of my political awareness came when I spent time with the likes of Uncle Kathy and Uncle Mosey Muller, who I was very close to. That's when you start to see a different perspective of what their view of what they intended to do in terms of for the country and the Freedom Charter, amongst everyone else. You know, there were a lot of people that I learned from. But in that process, what was their journey? But at a macro picture, how much of this can we celebrate and learn? Because there is a view, and I'm going to say biased in my view originally, is you've got to have everything to have success. But ironically, a lot of people, especially people of color, who've succeeded, and if we talk across all race lines, broadly, everybody's been through a journey and had their struggles and wins and losses along the way. But there's not enough time to celebrate that good story and to find the humanity of you just need to continue.
Oh, yes. I think you think this man Longfellow, where he talks about great men, of course, Longfellow, the 1800s, would have spoken about men, not people, because women were not expected to. So he says, and my father, whenever in the morning, when we are asleep, and we have to go and mow wheat, he says, well, it's time to wake up, go and mow wheat, very early, long before the sun rises, 4 o'clock in the morning. They say, well, the heights great men reached and kept were not by sudden flight, but they, when their companions slept, were scaffolding throughout the night. And it is that scaffolding that carries the nuggets of the struggle that has ultimately created conditions of success. So many in our communities, especially now, scaffolded through bribery and all these other things, and it happens to be too much celebrated. And doing the wrong thing seems to be the right thing. And this is the problem that we are facing of instant tender. The tenderpreneurship has installed this and instilled this. And in good part, question you are asking, when we were in Harvard in 2000, it was when outsourcing was the main thing. Smaller government, outsource everything. Now, you come out of a situation where the people that have to be addressed and whose plight has to be addressed are people who are cleaners, drivers, manual laborers, and so on, municipalities and everything. And you want those to operate in outsourced environments. It was crazy. It still remains very crazy. I mean, at stage I say I refused. I said, no, I'm not outsourcing anything. Because my conscience are these people, these cleaners and so on. Because if I succeed there, by knowing them and knowing the tribulations and trials they go through, then I can transform the situation. But if I put them in a corner somewhere to be cared for by someone else who is not part of the leadership of government, then we have a serious problem. Because it's maspumes again. I mean, you rotate, you keep on rotating. So the outsourcing and the smaller government, which was adopted by government then, was actually the wrong strategy. And it accelerated this program of degeneration. And I think we are in that space now where it looks like privatization is the motive force for government. And that privatization is not going to drive the agenda for change at all.
It seems to be strategic privatization. You know, for example, there's conversations of Eskom that they want to offload distribution and transmission because you then become the wholesaler system. But they don't want to sell Eskom because of historical contracts of supply and an exorbitant budget that government has to pay to procure the raw materials. So there's a sort of orchestrated unbundling of public infrastructure and systems?
Well, I mean, to do that without thinking about the role those institutions played in education. Unfortunately, ESCOM as a training platform was destroyed. The training part, Transnet, or what was a Spoornet, and so on. Right. So there are these strategic faults that we created against our intentions.
But who created it?
The government. Because, yes, government, when it came into power, all these things, and it's the philosophy of looking at what is core. So what was not core had to be removed.
But that education was part of the core.
Education in those SOEs was core.
Yes.
Because it helped to de-risk the private sector. Because anyone who came from those centers would immediately be employed.
Yes.
Now we have created a person like myself with a small briefcase, and I'm saying I'm providing education. What kind of education? You can't. Whereas those big centers created a manpower that would actually fill the gaps across. And private sector had no doubt about it. They were just waiting for that certificate of saying, this was my
trade paper.
Yes. Yeah.
And then these trade papers were valuable.
They were valuable, yes.
Now you've got to go FET, TVET. There's so many of these structures. Then you've got the CETAs and then universities. But even if you look at the entire purpose, and I mentioned to you earlier, I saw a clip about 2-3 days ago, and I think TikTok works on what I'm searching for, is former President Thabo Mbeki gave a speech as a former chancellor, and he said, even if a black child graduates or he gets the skill, he hands in his mind this entitlement of, I now am employable and I must be paid because I'm a graduate. He says, and the example he used is, you now have a BA in humanities or a BA in history. What economic value do you create today? Yes, you studied what happened. Great. What can you generate today as a skill? And he also spoke of what happened to the trade papers. Because in the old days, if you had your department manpower certificates, everybody wanted you.
Yes.
Now you come with your FET papers or you come with your college degrees. And I've had many graduates come to me from esteemed institutions, what's traditionally considered the big names in the country, even with honors, and they're completely not fit for purpose. So that disjoint is that fit for work versus graduation in the education versus what actually worked. And yes, it was a trade paper, but you could actually do the job.
Well, indeed. And you can see that in the numbers. I mean, the census is telling quite a lot. When you take people who actually completed the ambacht, the trades, pre-1994, when you plot them against those who got degrees, you see that the trend was the same across time. They were not matching, the trades were employing if percentage-wise lower than those who got degrees. Yes. But the trend was the same. Those who graduated post-1994 in the trades, a kink occurs that is downward for those who did trades. Now, so that the employers are beginning to doubt the quality of the trades. Whereas for those who have degrees, that has been maintained. People with degrees by 2012 were experienced about 5% unemployment, which basically was full employment for all intents and purposes. Now that has doubled to about 18, doubled and increased a little bit more to about 18%.
Yes.
And the missteps that have been done is, people have spent too much time in higher education because they repeat, they fail and so on, because there hasn't been a strategic push to ensure that they get everything they need so that they can go through that system quicker. What it has created, it's a glut of unemployed graduates, so we don't have people who pay tax.
And somebody mentioned this phrase to me the other day, career student.
Yes.
And I won't mention the party politics conversation, but somebody on a 3-year degree in his 9th year, because he's being funded to be there, it makes more sense that he stays in varsity because then he doesn't have to.
Yes. I mean, this is part of the problem that the converse also is true, that because they are not funded adequately to go through the process as quickly as possible, I mean, when we're in Lesotho, you are funded right round, books, everything. There was even a 30 rand allowance that, of course, the student would have to go and spend on alcohol and other things. But you would succeed.
Yes.
And this pattern you would see pre-1994, the students who were financed by churches, the UN and so on, they had full scholarship they would go through. Now, somebody comes and says, I'll pay your books. Another one says, I'll pay your... That is killing the system.
Let's step back for a moment, Doc, and sorry to interrupt, but let's look at the NSFAS system. That's a large amount of money every student gets. And obviously in, let's say, mostly, if not all, deserving cases. There is a large amount, and I actually looked at it 2 days ago in preparation for the discussion, is the fees are paid, the accommodation is paid, the meals are paid, the books are paid, you get a living allowance, you get a traveling allowance. All in, you're talking maybe 200,000-300,000 a year. I'm speculating a number, but it's a sizable amount of money. They are not resource constrained in any way. They live at the university. Everything is fully funded. And a fair number of people on those NSFAS system take what is colloquially called the extended program. A year, 2, 3, 4, longer. But they've got the same resources that every other student has across the system who are self-funding.
The university, when you had a scholarship in Lesotho, when you failed, and you got to leave.
Yes.
So
I see the NSFAS says if you fail, they won't pay your fees, but in reality, they just continue paying anyway.
You see, if there is no discipline in managing that, you get all these kinds of situations. You really have to have a very big discipline. Once you have passed matric, there's no reason why you should struggle going through the system. Yes. Of course, there are burdens of children at home, relatives, and so on that you have to think about. But you really need a system that embeds discipline for performance. Obviously, universities now have adopted a different way of tuition, where the lecturer doesn't get all 100% of his salary from the university. He has to go and hunt the other 50%. That infrastructure is destructive.
Yes.
Yes, that ecosystem is destructive. So we have all these gaps in the system. Now, that's where Motlomi says integrated reporting. If you have integrated reporting, you have a better idea of what needs to be done.
But then, I'll give you just on a light note. My brother and I are products of military scholarships. We went through that system. And by and large, most people who went through a military training, which is a dedicated year of your life, and I'm not saying that should be the period, but even basic training, and this is a microcosmic example, but the product of having gone through a military system where there's forced discipline, you were also told, well, we won't pay you a salary to pay your fees if you don't pass. Secondly, the fact that you went through that structured system guided your thinking and your mindset. It almost created the impression, and this, right, National Service also seemed to have fed that model I have in my mind is, if there's scholarships available, what stops us saying we'll fund you? Go through 3 months of military basic training. I'm not saying compulsory, but if you want these extra scholarships and extra funding, go learn the discipline that we standardize across the system. The government gets people who are ready for larger government service, and it doesn't have to be a military system. It could be like India and the US and others have a public administration training system. Go through that process first, and then use public funds. Because that then created the impression to me that when the discipline is forced on you, and you're being taught a structured system, it helps structure your thinking.
Absolutely. You need that. I mean, and in South Africa, that can be implemented very easily. The unfortunate thing is only in South Africa, I think people finish matric in December, and in January, they are supposed to be at university.
And the results still haven't come out.
The results haven't come out. In all other areas, you have a lead period of 7 months,
yes,
and then you go to university in October. And that is the gap where this disciplining or all this facilitation of processes can be made. Now, there's a mad rush. I mean, even under information technology, this mad rush cannot be solved. We really need something that allows university to start in October.
Admissions originally, and I'm talking 20 years ago, used to start mid-February.
Yeah. Oh, well, I mean, you can actually, generally you find that universities' calendar start in August to allow those who have finished in December time to really sort themselves out, thinking about the logistics and some work experience.
Yes.
Before they go to university. So all those things are things probably that we should consider going forward.
This has been very productive, Dr. Lehohla. In rounding up this, where do you think the top 3 priorities are for not just a country, but people like you and I? And what can we meaningfully do to make a meaningful change now that could have a sustainable impact?
I think our knowledge, what we have experienced, our failures and our misgivings should come into the pot of experience and talk to how we see issues, talking truth to power is very important, and providing the necessary guidance and the ability to demonstrate the sincerity of mission, that we are all in this together. And by saying this is wrong, it is not because we want to undermine anyone.
Yes.
But wrong is wrong. And if we can demonstrate and illustrate that an alternative is probably possible, mindful of the fact that the alternative might have not been tested, but through what Mutlomi talks about of pursuit of peace, because when you pursue peace, generally the outcome will be peaceful. that's the founding principle. And mobilizing stakeholders along that peaceful pursuit.
Yes.
And then by creating integrated reporting, you then marshal the evidence that provides foresight to what may actually be the output.
If I take it one level lower than that, and sorry to delve into it, but I'm looking for tangible solutions.
Yes.
People like you, I, and somebody listening into this conversation, what can we do to our immediate 4, 5, 10 people we have access to? Do we do mentorships? Do we do videos? Do we do podcasts? Do we do voice notes? Do we create community groups? What can we do in the next 3 to 6 months or 12 months that's tangible to a layperson in a community that we see potential, or we see potential in all of them, to help change this thinking?
Oh yes. I mean, for instance, I've been exposed to stats that say data. It's available to everyone, but pathways to interpreting and dealing with it are almost opaque to anyone who hasn't used the data. So by exposing people to the reality that we are living, and saying to change this reality, we may have to look this way, helps a lot. As I was, when we started, I said, I presented to the vice chancellors and heads of departments at a conference of universities in Natal, in Durban. And it was painful, but unsurprising to realize that while we have information systems that give us information across, not many are aware, yet they actually engage in very critical decision-making.
Yes.
If we conscientize and make this visible, then I think a change can percolate and come as quickly as possible. So podcast, information sessions, and so on within the community of practice that we work is an essential, it's a must.
Much appreciated.
Thank you very
I look
much.
forward to speaking to you again on more thoughtful and insightful discussions.
No, absolutely. I think we've touched on education. We now have to say, what is the ecosystem around which this education happens, the family and so on, which is another big issue.
Yes.
That people individually experience. But when you look at it, the aggregate, you can actually understand its implications and why we are held back from doing what the right things are.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much.
Great pleasure and appreciate it very much.
No, thank you very much.